Hello and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is a conversation with David Merkel, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and he was currently Managing Director of Summit International Advisors, LLC. He is a geostrategist, and today he is talking about the relationship between China and Russia. If you want to check out the journal, head on over to tnsr.org. And now, on to the conversation.
What I hope to talk to you all today about is a little bit of history, where great powers had competed before in Central Asia, and then the Sino-Soviet tension and rift and the opening of China. So a time period where Moscow and Beijing went from the closest of friends to even enemies. And then what we find about their diverging interests, particularly their diverging interests following the shambolic exit from Afghanistan and the unprovoked invasion by Moscow of Ukraine. So first, the Great Game. And of course, I'm talking about the Great Game between Imperial Britain and Tsarist Russia in the 1800s. And this took place around the middle of the 1800s and had some great characters. But mainly the issue was that Tsarist Russia was trying to gobble up the different khanates of Central Asia. And a colonel would go and take over a city or tame a tribe. And in European salons, they turn to the Russians and they say, no, that was not, he didn't have orders to do that. He wasn't supposed to do that. But of course, the territory was never returned. The soldier was promoted rather than punished. And in a few more years, they did so again. In the UK, they were concerned by this because they saw the Tsarist Russia inching towards the jewel in the empire, India. And they wanted to try and get the khanates in Central Asia, Bukhara, Khiva, Samarkand, to put aside their differences and join together to be a buffer against Russian advances. And there's some great characters in this, and it's something that would really get you motivated to read about Central Asia, is to read about the Great Game in a way. And one of my favorite stories is in Bukhara, and it's a gentleman by the name of Stoddard who went out there in 1838 to try and free European slaves and to get the Khanate to sign a friendship agreement. Things for diplomats were kind of difficult back then, so he was thrown into what was called a bug pit. He was thrown in by the Khan to a pit, a jail full of vermin and reptiles and bugs. And then Arthur Conley, who's a great character of the Great Game. In fact, his papers recovered by the Reverend Joseph Wolfe are what first introduced the words Great Game to the English audience. But Conley would go over there. Oftentimes they'd go disguised as Turkish dervishes or horse traders or different kind of traders. Arthur Conley, spelled the same way as the building here on campus is spelled, his disguise was as Khan Ali, which is kind of fun. But he went over there, and rather than releasing him, he was imprisoned, and then the Reverend found their beheaded bodies, and the Brits kind of continued with this Great Game against Tsarist Russia until late in the 1800s and until the Russians lost the war with Japan and the Brits were humiliated by the Boer War. And in the 1900s, rather than it being great power competition between these two in Central Asia, the new challenge seemed to be Germany. And they finally did a border demarcation. And also the Brits should have learned through two wars in Afghanistan that was a good enough buffer to keep Tsarist Russia from moving on into India. So you had great power competition in Central Asia. The next point is the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And of course, when Mao came to power in China, you had the two communist heads. You had the two communist states that had the best of relationships. But obviously, when Khrushchev replaced Stalin, the Chinese learned about the secret speech basically from the contents of the speech from the New York Times. And Mao began to think of Khrushchev as a revisionist, and tension kind of started between the two leaders. Mao, through the days of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, looked to the Soviet Union almost the way he was looking towards Washington. He had a capitalist enemy, and he had a revisionist enemy. And the tension really came to a conclusion, a high point, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in '68, and then you had the border war, clash, 7-month border war between China and the Soviet Union, some of it near Shenzhen, right in Central Asia. So again, this was a point where the two powers differed, where their interests differed. So as amazing as Kissinger and Nixon's opening with China was, it wasn't something that happened all of a sudden. The rift between China and the Soviet Union had been building up because of diverging interests and diverging ways that invasions were looked at, interests along the border in Central Asia, and then finally an open split where the United States was closer to each one of the powers than they were to each other. And this is something that regrettably some people in Washington tried to pursue before the war in Ukraine with Putin. They thought they looked at China as the pacing competition, that would be the real challenge of our future, and that we need to link up with Russia. And the problem is that they were pursuing Putin. They were pursuing Putin to try and join up with Putin relative to China. There hadn't been a 1969 border clash, and the seeds were not ready for any kind of a separation between Moscow and Beijing. So now let's kind of go right into Central Asia and look at where Russia and China's interests are. And one thing that's kind of important is there's been this great acceptability of late when we talk about a relationship between Beijing and Moscow as a partnership without limits. Even the White House is kind of trying to put out the idea that Moscow can't be satisfied as a junior partner, can't be satisfied as a junior partner with Beijing. And in Will's book on Reagan's foreign policy, we're all kind of reminded that the Soviet Union, after communism, really didn't think that it was going to fit into like a middle-sized European power, but they still thought it was going to be a table with two powers. It's just that it wouldn't be a Cold War and they wouldn't be communists. So why is why is Moscow content with being a junior power to China? And is there a place in the world where that would rub them a little bit too much? And I think that place is Central Asia. So Moscow's obviously dominated over Central Asia. It's done so far longer than during the time of the Soviet Union, but when they took over the Khanates. But today, it kind of continues to want to dominate and has been a security guarantor. That's been its role. So as it sees China increasing its economic power, it says that it can be a security guarantor. But its form of security is like a mafia boss and a shopkeeper. It's security from Moscow itself. That initially the threat of terrorism, those types of things were a concern, but more of late the issues have been Moscow's more heavy-handed, and China is becoming a little bit uncomfortable with that. President Xi, on his first trip after the COVID lockdown, was going to Samarkand for a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. He stopped off in Kazakhstan for the specific purpose of communicating to Moscow that China believed in territorial integrity, because there is everything in the world in Moscow and in telegraph channels and former prime ministers and former presidents talking about that the Kazakhs, the northern piece of Kazakhstan, which has a large Russian population, looks quite attractive. So what are the different interests? One of the different interests, specifically since the exit from Afghanistan and the start of the war. I mentioned security. Right now, the Central Asian republics, because Moscow was not able to be decisive in Ukraine, and also because of what they did in Ukraine, because they stood by in Armenia relative to Azerbaijan and the Nagorno-Karabakh, and they did nothing in a shelling battle between Turkmenistan and the Kyrgyz Republic. They questioned Russia's security guarantee. And China questions Russia's role in security, both their ability to keep things peaceful and also whether they're going to do something in Kazakhstan, whether they're successful or not in Ukraine. Infrastructure, and specifically the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Moscow-based, and the Belt Road Initiative. Now the Russians looked at the Belt Road Initiative much the way a lot of us looked at it. We couldn't tell whether it was an infrastructure project or a geopolitical glory project. And they were concerned and they wanted to benefit from it, but they didn't really see how they would benefit from it because the projects would be in the Far East of their country and not have real commercial benefits, but the government would have to guarantee the loans. But then they also saw a lot of infrastructure projects by the Chinese in Central Asia. The largest dry dock facility in the world is on the border between Xinjiang and Kazakhstan, the Khorbas facility. Now, after the war in Ukraine, the Belt Road Initiative, at least on land, confusingly, it's the land belt and the sea road, but the land belt has a northern, a center, and a southern route. The southern route goes through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. That's not real attractive. The northern route, which has been the most developed, goes through Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. And that, if you believe that our sanctions on Russia, European sanctions on Russia, are not a temporary thing, but a thing that's going to last, then that's no longer an option for China to get product to Europe. So then there's the middle corridor, which goes around the Caspian or at a certain point through the Caspian from the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and then over into Turkey. Now, China wants to keep roads open to the west, but Russia would want in its leverage to make sure that all roads go through Moscow. And therefore, there's a lot of pressure on the Central Asians not to be involved with this center corridor. Next is energy. Russia and China signed two huge energy deals. One in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, something that had been in the works for over a decade, and then the second in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine. But the Chinese have been quite skilled at ensuring that they're not overly reliant on Russia for energy. They also receive, in the form of gas, they also receive gas from Turkmenistan, from Australia, from Qatar, and from the United States. And of course, Russia wants to find a home for the energy that's no longer going to go to Europe and would like it to be China. But their competitor for that, in part, would be from Central Asia. Central Asia is having a harder time finding an opportunity to get things to go west, and therefore would see a better opportunity for more and more hydrocarbons to go east towards China. In fact, the largest export of Central Asian hydrocarbons, in this case oil, is through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium from Kazakhstan. This is a big Chevron thing, but it goes right into Novorossiysk, Russia. So ExxonMobil, who owns a percentage of this, in their filing to the Securities and Exchange Commission, indicated that they may have loss of revenue or cash flow because there may be sanctions on the CPC, or the Russians may respond by cutting off the CPC. And in fact, in its 20 years of existence, last year, in the last 12 months, Putin has cut off the CPC 3 times. So where do we go from here? When I was in government, when Will and I worked at the NSC together, in the national security strategy, pointed out that Central Asia was an abiding foreign policy interest. We have been working in Central Asia for 30 years. One would have to say that the high point of that work had to do with Afghanistan. It was supporting operations in Afghanistan that led us to have military overflight and rescue agreements with all the countries, as well as a base in Uzbekistan, Karshakhanabad, and in the Kyrgyz Republic, Manas. We have none of that anymore, and we're not in Afghanistan. And then it's also often the point that if we're talking about great power competition, people say, well, you don't want to get into a Cold War mentality. We have interests in all these different countries. Now, Secretary Blinken was just in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and hearing from all five of the governments afterwards, it was a nothing burger. It was a box-checking exercise. It's important, part of living is showing up. It's definitely important, and I salute Secretary Blinken for taking the trip. But the point is that the Central Asians were disappointed. Why were they disappointed? Because there was no discussion about security, and therefore the Central Asians are forced to either do what the Russians want or try and get the Chinese to play a larger role in security. The discussion was secondary sanctions. A lot of product has gone specifically through Kazakhstan to help Russia avoid sanctions, and they made a point that they're going to come out with new restrictions. The Kazakhs are in April, overdue, but they're doing it now. But the compensation of the countries for the sanctions, the effect of sanctions for a neighbor nearby were quite minuscule compared to the assistance that China is paying and the threat that Russia's under. And I think that's fine. My point is that what has united Russia and China for so long in Central Asia is to counter the United States. And as we look at the period of great power competition, what are our interests in Central Asia? We should definitely stay true to our values, and if something happens there that's negative, we should point that out. But what are our interests there that would be greater than having an opportunity for tension to grow between Moscow and Beijing? And in answering that question, it's hard to imagine placing an investment as large as we did during Operation Enduring Freedom. So this sounds a little bit like President Obama's "don't do something, just sit there." And I don't mean that. I mean that we need to be thoughtful and sophisticated. But I think that our actions oftentimes really bring Moscow and China together. And I've seen that in Central Asia. I was sharing this with somebody on a day quite like today. They pointed out that I had a Cold War mentality. I pointed out to them, if you go outside and it's rainy, you don't have a rainy day mentality. You just see what's happening and try and have a policy that influences or affects that. The other way of saying this is what's happening already. Is the United States and Europe are minor players there. The only real actor from the United States standpoint is Chevron, and the Kazakhs have just taken all the different companies to court to try and get some more money out of them for past profits because they're in an economic situation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.